Romney, and you're watching Taped with Rabbi Doug.
We're gonna watch Rabbi Doug on the TV tonight.
Forget about the network programs. Forget about all the great cable shows. There's only one thing for me on Mondays and Tuesday nights. Rabbi Doug.
We're gonna see Rabbi Doug. We're gonna watch Rabbi Doug. Yeah, we're gonna watch Rabbi Doug on your TV tonight.
Shalom and welcome to Taped with Rabbi Doug. Glad you could be with us today. My guest today is news anchor, restaurant commentator, and good friend, Mr. Sherman Kaplan from WBBM Newsradio 780 AM. And welcome to the show, Sherman.
You've got all the credentials right. Thank you. Nice to see you, Doug. Glad to be here.
I'm glad to have you here. We have a mutual friend from the station, and it was just a happy medium when he mentioned to me that he'd be willing to come on my show, and I'm so glad to have you with us. Probably one of the most recognized voices on radio.
But not faces.
But not faces, and probably for a very good purpose, because you review so many restaurants throughout the year. You are probably the most well-known in the Midwest as far as restaurant reviewers, and probably people, when you come into a restaurant, almost never know it's you.
Well,
is that right?
New City Magazine called me the Dean of Chicago Restaurant Critics, which is pretty good for a guy who just thinks of himself as I feel like there's a 17-year-old kid inside of me.
And you enjoy eating?
I do enjoy eating, yes. I have to be careful what I eat, but I do enjoy it, yes, absolutely.
Great. If you just wanted to take a guess, maybe you have a little tally sheet that goes across the room, how many restaurants have you actually reviewed over the years?
Well, I've been doing it. I started reviewing in 1971. The first restaurant I reviewed was the restaurant at the time called the 95th, which was on top of the John Hancock Center. It's now the Signature. Entirely different concept, different owners. I would say that in that almost 30 years, I've 1,000 restaurants, 1,500.
1,500
restaurants. Maybe 1,500.
If I asked you to guesstimate, how many of those restaurants are still open that you've reviewed, not in the recent year or anything like that, but from 10 years ago and beyond?
Well, that's a great question, really, because restaurants do come and go. There are so few that are really those that have lasted and will continue to last, and some that come quickly to mind, the Cape Cod Room and the Drake, Eli's on Chicago Avenue, Nick's Fish Market, my favorite Italian restaurant, Giannotti, which has been in 3 or 4 different locations. I think its current one now is on Lawrence and Cumberland in Norwich. Some of the Greek restaurants along Halsted Street, some of the Chinese restaurants in Chinatown, those that have found a place for themselves, a niche in their ethnic neighborhoods, tend to stay because they are authentic and they are honest to what they do.
And interestingly enough, in the kosher restaurant business, only one restaurant has been here for more than 2 decades, I believe, and that is Falafel King on Oakton Avenue.
Well,
of all the kosher restaurants,
I've heard of Falafel King. I don't think I've ever eaten there, but I have heard of it. And yes, and what a wonderful name for a restaurant.
Yeah, and I don't believe that there is another kosher restaurant that's been around for more than 2 decades, and they come and go as well.
Some years ago, I was asked to review Chicago's kosher restaurants for, and I don't remember the publication. I don't think it was the JUF News, but it was another publication. And at that time, the kosher restaurants in Chicago were primarily fast food restaurants, which most of them still are, congregated along Devon Avenue around California. Today, we have a couple of more restaurants that have a little more panache than just a fast food restaurant. Shallot's being the premier restaurant.
Bugsey's and Skokie also.
Bugsey's, I don't know. I've never heard of Bugsey's.
Bugsey's is next to Ken's Diner.
And then there's one called Slice of Life.
Slice of Life, yeah.
There used to be a kosher restaurant in the Hyatt Regency.
Yes, it was called La Misada.
That's right.
La Misada. And when the Hyatt was sold to a Japanese company, at that time the restaurant was closed.
No. I have eaten in a kosher Chinese restaurant on Devon called Mitsuyan. I believe that's the name of it. Rather
Mitsuyan.
Mitsuyan, that's
which
it.
in Hebrew means perfect.
Yeah.
Mitsuyan.
Well, and it was a good restaurant.
Yeah. I got engaged in that restaurant.
Well, congratulations.
My wife and I about 8.5 years ago, almost 9 years ago, got engaged in that restaurant. As a matter of fact, that you mentioned it.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Well, see,
It's a neat place.
It's a landmark for you.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a landmark, and recently sold to somebody I grew up with who now owns it on its second owner since its first.
And there's a new kosher restaurant in Highland Park, the grill that has just opened next to Shavitz Butchers, owned by the same people, I believe.
Yeah,
which I have to confess I haven't been into yet.
Yeah, there have been a few. What do you think is your favorite type of food to eat? I heard you say there was an Italian restaurant that you liked a lot. What is your favorite type of food? I'm sure you've had every type of cuisine just about out there.
Well, it really is Italian. I think if I could come back in another life, I'd want to come back as an Italian Jew. That seems to combine the best of both worlds.
Yeah, I would say the food.
And there are several Italian restaurants that I love, and each of them is really kind of different because there's such a wide variety of Italian food. My wife and I were fortunate enough to be in Italy for a couple of weeks over this past spring, and I came back, and as much as we loved the trip, the one thing I learned was that it really spoiled Italian restaurants for me in this country, because as good as the Italian restaurants are here, they cannot be the same as the way they really are in Italy. For one thing, the Italian restaurants here serve portions that are way too large. For another thing, they don't have always the same ingredients or the same style of cooking, and they're cooking to American taste, not Italian taste. There's a big difference between an Italian restaurant and an Italian-American restaurant.
Well, I can
it was
just
a real
say,
lesson for me.
The only place I've eaten in restaurants, of course, I eat kosher always, in France. I've been in France, and in Israel. And in Canada, but France and Israel. And I got to say, if I had to compare, the French, of course, made kosher food, so it wasn't such a French cuisine as it was a mixture of Israeli and French cuisine. But in Israel, the Israeli cuisine is certainly not incomparable to the Israeli-style restaurants in Chicago. The way they serve even a falafel, the salads that they put in falafel, they put American salad in falafel in America.
Yeah.
In Israel, they put Israeli salad,
the way
and it changes the taste right there.
The way it should be, absolutely.
Yeah, so I agree with that.
So our dining, our ethnic dining here is really hyphenated, just like ethnic
American Italian or American
exactly,
Chinese.
Exactly
sure,
right.
Sure, I understand completely.
Yeah. There are some restaurants I think that do come closer to the real experience that I've had in Italy. But one of them that comes to mind is a restaurant called Augustino's on Harlem Avenue near Fullerton. This is the cooking of southern Italy, Calabrese, near the boot. The toe of the boot. Probably
authentic Italian chefs and things like that,
absolutely,
of course.
Absolutely.
To make it
and then there's a restaurant out here in Highwood that I enjoy quite a bit called Trattoria Giacomo. And it's kind of an idiosyncratic restaurant because of the nature of the owner, who is just one of these kind of people who's got his hands on everything and gets to know his customers.
Sure.
And that's really another key to a good restaurant.
Oh, absolutely.
But I think that's true of any business, Doug.
I agree.
Or being a rabbi.
Yeah,
you got to know your customers.
You do have to know your customers, and people learn to like you. I can just give just the idea of an example that if you don't get to know your congregants, they don't want to come back to you. They'll go find someplace else where the rabbi would get to know them, and it's the same thing in the restaurant business. If you are a regular at a place and the maitre d' or the manager or the owner, whoever's there on a regular basis, doesn't start to recognize your face after you've been there 10 times in a month and a half, then you say to yourself, why am I spending my money here when I don't feel at home here?
And that is the biggest thing that I miss about being a restaurant critic, because I have to maintain my anonymity. There are only a few restaurants where I've gone back to again and again and have come to know the owners, and they've come to know me as a regular customer. Trattoria Giacomo in Highwood, I mentioned. A wonderful Greek restaurant in Glenview called Periali, which is on Milwaukee Avenue. We go there time and time again. And a Chinese restaurant in Glenview that we've been going to before I started to review restaurants, called the Dragon Inn North. So I do drop my mask, but I don't review those restaurants anymore. They know it, Sure. And I'm just in as another customer who enjoys that kind of treatment that regular customers get in a restaurant.
Now, I understand that...
It happens to me sometimes at Carlos, too, I have to confess, which is not so bad.
That's cool. I understand that being on TV isn't unique for you, but being as you are today is unique, because I understand that you were on John Callaway's show one time, and you were not sitting as you are right now. How did you appear on that show so people wouldn't recognize you?
I was invited to appear on a panel of Chicago Tonight at the time that the National Restaurant Association show was in. And there was Rich Melman was one of the panelists.
Let Us Entertain Your Restaurants.
Exactly. who I knew Rich, so it wasn't like I was trying to hide my identity from him. There was the president of the association, a man named Grisanti, who owns restaurants in Louisville, and me, and I appeared because I didn't want to be recognized by other restaurateurs who might be watching the show. I wore a black hood. I mean, I had eyes cut out and a little space for my mouth, and I hope it disguised my identity. So good thing it was black. Oh, it was definitely, yes.
Very interesting. You are, the restaurant business has made you famous. You have a number of books you've authored.
I've been writing restaurant guides. Now, I've been reviewing since 1971. I've been writing restaurant guides since 1977. They come out about every 3 years or so. And my 9th book is just out on the stands.
Very, very, very nice. And people can find it in bookstores everywhere.
Bookstores. It's also on the internet at internet sales spots.
Great.
So you can find it all over the world.
Great.
It's been but the thing that I like to stress really, Doug, is everybody should be their own restaurant critic. What I do, or what Phil Vitale does, or Pat Bruno for the Sun-Times, is good. I think we perform a service. But people have to understand that a restaurant critic is of no value to them until they understand his body of work. You can't judge how I, as a critic, are going to help you pick a restaurant until you've read or heard several reviews. It's the same thing with Roger Ebert and film, or Richard Christensen in theater.
One person's opinion isn't everyone's opinion.
Well, it's not only that, but you have to understand their body of work. You have to understand their prejudices. You have to understand their biases.
What turns them on, what turns them off as individuals.
Exactly right, because there are people who might read what Roger Ebert has to say and use him as a wonderful guide even though they never agree with him. Mm-hmm. You don't have to agree with a critic to understand what he's telling you and to use his information to guide you to the kind of movies you may or may not like.
I had Gene Siskel of blessed memory on my show, and I was talking to him after the brief interview when he hosted Israel's 50th anniversary at Northwestern a number of years ago. He was the master of ceremonies, and we were talking. I said, I don't always agree with you, but I don't always agree with Ebert either, so I read both of you. Then I decide which one's review I like better.
No critic ever expects everybody to agree with us, and that debate is good. You need to think about what you hear or what you read. And I think that's true not only with restaurant criticism or film or any of the artistic criticisms, it's true of journalism. I'm very proud of my profession as a journalist. Restaurant criticism takes up a very small part of my time. The bulk of my time is preparing and delivering the news on News Radio 780.
And that's really what I wanted to bring up next. You are the voice of the news. You're there. It seems like you're there day and night, because it seems like I know you've switched shifts.
Yes.
And so you were at night. So I didn't have you on the show in the recent past because you were working nights. And I know
I was working late. It was afternoons.
Right, late afternoons.
Now I'm
the
on
evening.
midday.
Now you're midday, and you're here.
I like it quite a bit. But we try as journalists to be as credible as we can be. And I can give you a perfect example of how we know we're doing the right thing. Let's take the recent presidential election. We'll get calls, listeners will complain, you're too biased towards Al Gore. You're too biased towards George W. Bush. Well, when we get both of those kind of criticisms, we know we're doing the right thing. We're right down the middle.
You're right down the
because
middle.
we're seen as biased by either side.
Well, what do you think about bias in the news? It seems like when we read one newspaper...
Well, I'm against it.
I hope so. I hope so. When we read one newspaper, we see not only the elections, the Middle East, what's going on. You seem to, the different critics and the different news reporters, their reports often find them focusing on one side and not bringing the view of the other side in with that. And when you look at the one side, it seems so biased so often. How is that good journalism or professional journalism if you see only one side of it in a story?
For one reason, a reporter can only be in one place at one time or within a limited area. Secondly, if you're talking about radio or television, they have only a limited amount of time to give a report. There's only so much information that our CBS correspondent in Jerusalem, Robert Berger, can get out in a 45-second report. Frankly, I think that anybody who depends on the broadcast media, radio and television for their news is missing the news. You must keep up to date with newspapers. You must keep up with current event magazines. You must keep up with commentary magazines. I'm not saying commentary specifically, but I mean those magazines that do delve into political comment, whether it's the National Review or the New Republic. you need to read major papers too, in addition to the Chicago Sun-Times and the Tribune, to look at the New York Times, and you don't have to subscribe to it. Just check it out on the internet every now and then. The LA Times, the Washington Post. I mean, these are important sources of news. You can also, of course, use the internet to look at newspapers all over the world, because it's just right there at our fingertips. This information that we now have is so abundant. There is no excuse for anybody not being well informed as long as they undertake the effort. We can only give you so much. You, as a news consumer, have to reach out and take it in and do it on your own. You don't get the news by being spoon-fed. And if you do, you will get biased news.
You've been at News Radio 78, now News Radio 780
Yes.
for a long time. How long have you actually been at the station delivering news?
I started there on February 17th, 1969.
Wow.
And it's
Wow.
been
I
a
was
long
still in
run. No time
elementary
off for
school.
good behavior either.
How did you get into news journalism? How did this all start
That's a
for
good
you?
question, because I started out in my in radio as a rock and roll disc jockey.
Really? Where were you at?
In Cincinnati, Ohio, which is where I grew up. My first radio job was actually in the high school cafeteria playing records during lunch. I mean, that's how I got my start. Not very sophisticated at all or exciting. I happened to be dating a girl at the time whose uncle and father were in the television repair business, and we're talking now the late 1950s. They decided that as
The black and white television repair
well,
business.
I think there might have been color television then, but in any event, they were ham radio hobbyists, and at that time, FM radio was in its infancy, and they got a license for an FM radio station, and because I knew their daughter and the niece, I got a job on this radio station, and it was basically just spinning records and this and that, and just kind of segueing and learning, sweep the floors and everything that came with it. You did everything. I went to college at Miami University of Ohio, where I worked on the college radio station there. Then I wanted to get more courses in broadcasting than Miami of Ohio had, and I came back to Cincinnati at the University of Cincinnati, where I completed my education in broadcasting. And it was while I was there that somebody called me up, a friend of a friend, and said, we have an opening for an all-night disc jockey on what then was the big Top 40 station, Top 40 radio in Cincinnati. And I went on the air, not as Sherman Kaplan, but as Mike Sherman, the night creature. And I did that for about 4 years. And all along, I was just getting a little bit restless with it because I knew I wanted to do something a little more substantial. And I'm going to tell you a true story. On November 22nd, 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated. I went into work that night. It was a Friday night. And I remember this very vividly. To its good sense, the radio station dropped the top of 40 rock and roll, which was playing some very subdued kind of music. Now, every weekend, kids would come up to the radio station and ask for requests. And this particular Friday night, these same kids came up and wanted to hear all of their top 40 hits. And I thought, my God, the president has just been assassinated. What is wrong with these idiots? And I decided right there I no longer wanted to be in rock and roll radio. And 4 months later, I left it. Unfortunately, my timing was a little bad because the month after I left, the remaining 7 good guy disc jockeys all got together, pooled their money, and produced a rock and roll show featuring a new group that had just come to the United States called the Beatles. You may have heard of them. So I missed that.
Oh, my.
But I left radio, did something else. I was working for IBM Corporation. To be honest, I was in sales. Not very exciting. I was in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Every time I'd turn on the radio, I'd hear somebody, and I'd say, I know I can do a better job than that. I know I can. And like they say, you can take the elephant out of the theater, but you can't take the theater out of the elephant. Well, I wanted to get back into the business. I did in Charleston, West Virginia, where I had an opportunity now to get into news and learn the craft and the art of news on radio, and spent 2.5 years in Charleston, West Virginia, which happened to be the city where I was born, as a matter of fact. But it was just coincidence I went back. Then moved to Columbus, Ohio, and I was there for 2.5 years, and my wife and I came to Chicago on a vacation in 1968, right before the Democratic Convention. And a friend of mine said, there's a CBS radio station about a block from where you're staying, and they're going to go all news. Why don't you go in and audition? So I did. I mean, I really wasn't looking for a job. I just wanted somebody in a major market to hear what I was doing and just give me an evaluation. Then I'd go back to Columbus and I'd be real happy. And I did the audition, and I was told, well, we don't have any openings now, but we are thinking about staying with an all-news format, and we really like what we've heard, and if we decide to stay with this all-news, we will call you in a few months. And in January, they called me, and that's when they hired me and 6 other broadcasters.
Anyone else whose name we would still know?
Absolutely. Len Walter came in about 2 weeks before I did. Len Walter is our business correspondent. Dick Helton, who used to be with us, he's now at KNX in Los Angeles, used to be doing Afternoon Drive. Alan Bickley, a couple of others whose names escape me at the moment, but no longer at WBBM. But Len and I are the only ones of that 6. But there were other people who were there before us. So anyway, so that's how I came to Chicago. And then about a year and a half later, I got this idea about restaurant reviews, just as kind of a sideline, because I saw the newspapers had them, and if we were an all-news station, we should have this. And I proposed it to our news director at the time, and he said, okay, give it a try, and go try this new restaurant that just opened in that tall building. And that was the first restaurant review.
95th.
Yeah.
Right. Very interesting career.
So I've been to the top and I've been to the bottom when it comes to restaurants.
You've been everywhere, and you've been to the top and bottom in restaurants, and you were almost at the top in radio, bringing the Beatles, missed that, but you got up there anyway.
Well,
what would you say to somebody who wants to get into radio journalism? Do you think that there's room for new radio journalists in the Chicago area?
There is a tremendous need for good broadcasters. And the first criteria they have, it's not the voice so much. I mean, voice is important, but you no longer hear the deep enunciation.
I'm Walter Cronkite.
Yes, that's not what it's all about. What it is all about is being real and being human, and you must be a good writer, because if you cannot write, you cannot communicate.
You must be reading my mind, because when we finished saying this, I wanted to ask you, do you write
I was
your own
reading your
news
mind,
stories?
as a matter of fact. I am a mind reader, too.
Do
yes.
you write your own news stories?
I'm on for 5 hours a day. I write the first hour. Now, that's not 60 minutes of news, of course, because we've got commercials and features. But within that hour, there are probably 8 to 10 minutes of news that we produce. I write about 5 minutes of it. My co-anchor, Chris Crydell, writes the other 5 minutes.
When I told my wife you're going to be on tonight, she said, is Chris coming with him?
She might have if you'd invited her.
Well, maybe we'll do that another time. That'd be very nice. It'd be kind of a nice pair of you with your backs to
she doesn't mind.
She'd show herself.
Yes.
I know. She doesn't go to the restaurant, sure. It's amazing, the whole idea. Have you ever been interested in going into TV? Has the idea of just making the change and going into television, have you had any offers to go into television? Your voice is so radio and so perfect.
I will be real honest with you. I have done a little television sideline, never as a news anchor. I've done a couple of special series for Channel 2 on, years ago I did a series on ethnic grocery stores, and that was kind of fun. But no, I've never really had a desire to go into television full time. First of all, there's no security, or very little. My overriding goal was to find security, and when I came to Chicago, in a business which is very insecure, I realized I was at a place I liked, in a city I liked, that was great for us to raise a family. And Eileen and I have settled down here, and this is where we decided we wanted to stay.
We're very happy you did. Yeah. We're very happy you're here. Being that you are doing the news, all day while you're there, and you're repeating stories is it every 20 minutes, every 15 minutes?
It varies. I mean,
it varies.
But yes,
does it ever seem to get monotonous to you to keep repeating the same stories all day long?
There is no question about it. I think the biggest thing that any news anchor on a news radio station fights is the occasional tedium that will set in when you're in those lull periods when you don't really have a major story to cover in depth. I've always felt, though, that being a news anchor, you have to be part journalist and you have to be part showman. And a lot of my colleagues, I think, probably would disagree with this, but I think being a rock and roll disc jockey helped me develop the kind of presence and vitality that I think is so very important to present oneself over the air. All we have to sell is the sound of our voice and the way we speak. Here on television, you're only seeing the back of my head, so you really don't have the gestures and the animation that might be in my expressions. But as a broadcaster, I have got to sound excited and interested and vital about everything I'm saying, because I can't expect my audience to be interested if I don't sound interested.
I think one of the things that I notice about you, and I do listen to you a lot, is that you're very spontaneous, because it seems like sometimes a news story falls apart, or the commercial doesn't come on when it's supposed to, or whatever the case might be, and you seem to jump in and be prepared for that, even though the pressure must be there to just say, I've always got to be ready just in case.
Well, I think you always have to be attentive. You have to be on your toes. It's something, I guess, that comes over the years. I mean, I do it now with almost thinking about it. The instant I hear dead air, I talk. Sometimes I'm talking at the wrong time, but the instant I hear that, I talk. You were talking about spontaneous. I'll tell you just a quick story, kind of a funny story. Over the years, I've had the pleasure of doing an awful lot of interviews with a large number of celebrities. Not as much now as I did in the past, but that's another story. There was a time when I was interviewing Maureen Stapleton. Now, there happened to be a recorded interview. We were not live on the air, but nonetheless, we recorded it as if it was a live interview for later broadcast. And at one point in the conversation, I said to her, spontaneously, when you were growing up, was there any competition about going into the theater and acting with your sister? She said, my sister? I said, your sister, Jean Stapleton. She said, Jean Stapleton isn't my sister. So I paused for a moment and I said, I said, am I the first one who ever made that mistake? Well, she said, well, you're the first one who ever made it with such conviction.
That's a wonderful,
so
wonderful
we
story.
occasionally, I occasionally have those problems.
That's great. I want to thank you for being on the show.
My pleasure.
This has just been my pleasure. I hope to have you back sometime. Maybe we'll invite Chris to come with you.
That'd be ball.
That would be great. I'd love to hear another time about some of the famous people, more of the famous people. There's so many things I wanted to ask you, and time just runs out. I want to thank you, our audience, for being here on Taped with Rabbi Doug. Remember, we're on every week at this time. I want to thank my guest, Sherman Kaplan of WBBM Newsradio 780 AM, and hope you'll tune in and listen to him as much and enjoy it as much as I enjoy listening to him, and as much as you enjoyed seeing part of him and listening to him today. And see you next time. Shalom.